The afternoon sun bathed the airport runway in golden light as Robert stepped into the terminal, blending in like any other weary traveler. His gray jacket was faded, his shoes worn but polished, and his cap slightly crooked atop his graying hair. No briefcase, no assistant, no flashy watch. Just a folded boarding pass in his back pocket and a silent presence that turned no heads. No one knew who he was. That was the point. Robert had spent decades building everything from scratch. Now at 64, he owned one of the largest regional airlines in the country. But today, he wasn't here as the boss. He was here as a passenger, an undercover one. After recent complaints about rude staff and poor service, he wanted to see what was really going on with his airline. He chose the busiest route, wore his oldest clothes, and booked an economy seat online, just like any struggling traveler would. He wanted the full experience, unfiltered. As he joined the line at gate 19, no one gave him a second glance. Except the flight attendant at the boarding desk, Amanda. She wrinkled her nose slightly when he stepped forward. "Sir, can you step aside for a moment?" she said coolly. Robert raised an eyebrow but didn't protest. He stepped out of line calmly. Behind the counter, Amanda whispered something to her colleague Jason. Both of them glanced at Robert and chuckled. He caught the smirk, but said nothing. He was used to being underestimated. He just didn't know that this time, it would go too far. As passengers began to board, Robert stood near the side wall quietly, watching people shuffle past. Amanda barely acknowledged him. After a while, she glanced his way and muttered. "You can go in now, sir. Just, please be quick." The tone was sharp, impatient. Not welcoming. Inside the aircraft, Robert made his way to seat 29A, right by the window at the back. He moved slowly but with purpose, nodding to the person seated beside him. A young woman with earbuds in and zero interest in conversation. Robert folded his jacket and placed it carefully in the overhead compartment. As he settled in, he noticed the cabin crew moving up and down the aisle, smiling warmly at the well-dressed businessmen in first class and the sharply dressed influencers filming videos at the front. But their expressions shifted as they glanced toward the back, toward him. Moments later, a male flight attendant approached. "Sir, are you sure you're in the right seat?" the man asked with forced politeness. Robert pulled out his ticket and handed it over without a word. The attendant looked it over and hesitated for a beat. "Right," he mumbled, handing it back. As he walked away, Robert heard him mutter under his breath to another crew member, "Looks like anyone can fly these days." Robert turned to look out the window, his face expressionless, but his heart heavy. Not with embarrassment, but disappointment. He had spent his life building a company based on dignity, on lifting people up. And here he was, witnessing his own staff doing the opposite. But this was only the beginning. He hadn't come just to observe. He had come to change everything. The flight hadn't even taken off, yet Robert felt the weight of humiliation pressing down on him. He remained silent, breathing slowly, watching how every tiny gesture from the crew favored certain passengers while ignoring others like him. He wasn't looking for special treatment, just decency. But that seemed too much to expect. The tension escalated when a small disturbance occurred. A mother with 2 toddlers was struggling to fit her luggage in the overhead bin. Robert instinctively rose to help, lifting the bag with ease and offering a gentle smile. Just then, Amanda came down the aisle briskly. "Sir, please don't touch other people's luggage," she snapped, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. The mother opened her mouth to explain, but Amanda had already moved on, muttering something under her breath. The woman looked embarrassed. Robert simply nodded and returned to his seat, his hands resting calmly on his knees. But that wasn't the worst of it. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Amanda and Jason returned with stern faces. "Mr. Robert, is it?" she asked, glancing at his boarding pass again. "There's been a seating error. You'll need to step off the plane." The cabin quieted. People turned. Robert blinked slowly. I was assigned this seat. We understand, but due to a technical issue with your booking, we'll have to ask you to disembark, Jason added. He knew it wasn't true. He had confirmed everything when he booked. This wasn't a mistake. This was about his appearance. Robert stood slowly. The eyes on him weren't just curious, they were cruel. He could hear the murmurs. Probably tried to sneak on. Bet he bought a fake ticket. As he walked down the aisle, head bowed, a few people even chuckled. He didn't argue. He didn't shout. He just walked off the flight. But as his feet touched the ground again and he stepped back into the terminal, something in him clicked. They had no idea who he was. But they would. Very soon. Robert walked away from the boarding gate without a word, moving slowly through the terminal like a man invisible to the world. But inside, his heart thundered. Not from rage, but from resolve. He found an empty bench by the large window overlooking the runway and sat down, pulling out his phone. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the one marked, Board Exec. HQ, and dialed. A soft voice answered. Good evening, Mr. Barlow. Are you okay? Robert Barlow didn't reply right away. He stared out at the plane that had just taken off, without him. Pull up the staff log for Flight 443. I want every crew member's name on my desk within the hour, he said quietly. Yes, sir. Right away. He hung up and leaned back against the bench. Robert Barlow had founded Skyfleet Airways 32 years ago with a single rented aircraft and a vision, that every traveler deserved to be treated with respect, no matter their background, race, or income. His rise from taxi driver to aviation mogul was the stuff of legends, but he had never lost touch with his roots. Yet the airline he built, his legacy, had allowed arrogance to fester among its staff. It wasn't about revenge. It was about correction. And that began tonight. At Skyfleet headquarters, alerts began to ping across executive dashboards. The CEO was making moves, and quietly, quickly, every department head knew what that meant. Meanwhile, on the plane, Jason and Amanda were celebrating their victory at the back galley. That guy was probably trying to scam his way into a free flight, Amanda scoffed. Yeah, Jason laughed. Next time dress like you can afford a seat. Neither of them noticed the email that had just entered their inboxes. Subject, immediate suspension, pending internal review. The storm had begun. But it was far from over. By 6:45 the next morning, the senior leadership team at Skyfleet Airways sat stiffly in the executive boardroom, an expansive glass-walled space on the 34th floor of the company's headquarters. No one had slept. Not after the CEO himself had requested an emergency meeting with only one cryptic note, Flight 443. Full briefing. No excuses. At precisely 7 a.m., Robert entered the room. No fanfare. No entourage. Just him, in the same plain clothes from the day before. He didn't sit. He walked slowly to the head of the table, placed both hands on the polished wood, and let the silence stretch. Then, in a calm voice, he spoke. I was kicked off my own flight yesterday. A few gasps slipped through the air. Others stared, stunned. I wore simple clothes. I boarded like any regular man. And I was humiliated, insulted, and treated like a criminal. Not by accident. By culture. A culture we've allowed to grow. He paused, scanning each face. And it ends today. He turned to the HR director. Effective immediately, Amanda Cross and Jason Hill are suspended. Launch a full audit of in-flight crew conduct across all major routes. To the operations manager. We're implementing a mandatory empathy and ethics training program, starting next week. Every single employee. Top to bottom. No exceptions. And to the VP of branding. Get the PR team ready. But we're not spinning this. We're owning it. We're going public with what happened, and we're leading by example." The room was dead silent. Robert finally sat, exhaling. His expression wasn't angry, it was tired. Tired of watching people with power forget compassion. He looked out the window at a Skyfleet jet climbing into the sky. "We forgot what this company stands for," he said softly. "Let's fix it. Before the passengers do it for us." And with that, the real work began. By noon, a carefully worded official statement from Skyfleet Airways hit every major news outlet, aviation blog, and social media platform. The header was simple. "We apologize. Here's why." The post included a written apology signed by Robert Barlow himself. It acknowledged what had happened, without sugarcoating. It described the incident on Flight 443, admitted the error in judgment, and vowed sweeping changes across the airline, starting from the top. But what shocked the world most wasn't the apology. It was the revelation that the man who had been kicked off the flight was the founder and CEO of the company. The media exploded. Hashtags like #CEO in disguise and #RespectAllPassengers began trending worldwide. Influencers, business leaders, and everyday flyers all weighed in. Some praised Robert's humility and courage. Others criticized the airline for allowing such behavior to fester. But everyone agreed on one thing: it was a wake-up call. In a modest house on the outskirts of town, Amanda stared at her phone screen in horror. Her face had been captured in a blurry photo someone had taken during the incident, now going viral. Jason was no better. He had deleted all his social media profiles within hours. Meanwhile, Robert sat in his office, quietly observing. He wasn't proud of what had happened. But he was proud of what was about to happen next. He wasn't just changing a company. He was changing an industry. And behind all the buzz, the press, and the headlines, something else was brewing. A letter, handwritten and sealed, lay on his desk, addressed to someone unexpected. Because there was still one more lesson to be taught. And it wasn't for the crew. It was for the world. While the world raged and trended, Robert's mind wasn't on the news, the public praise, or the rapid fallout. He sat alone in his office, finishing a handwritten letter. Something he hadn't done in years. The letter wasn't addressed to Amanda. Not Jason either. It was addressed to seat 29B. The young woman who had sat beside him. The one who hadn't joined in the laughter. The one who hadn't judged him or flinched away when he sat down. She hadn't spoken a word, but her silence had held no disgust, just quiet presence. Robert remembered how she had subtly offered him a tissue when Amanda scolded him for helping the mother with the bags. No words. Just compassion in a simple gesture. He wanted her to know he remembered. Inside the envelope was a short note that read: "In a world loud with judgment, your silence spoke kindness. Thank you. Enclosed is a voucher for lifetime first-class access on all Skyfleet flights. Sincerely. Robert Barlow, CEO." He didn't sign it with flair or include a business card. He didn't want attention. He just wanted her to know that dignity still mattered, and that someone noticed. He handed the envelope to his personal assistant with instructions to trace her name from the flight manifest and deliver it discreetly. Later that evening, while others talked about firings and reform, this unnamed young woman would walk into her tiny apartment and find a letter waiting at her door. She would open it, puzzled. And then she would smile. Because in the middle of a noisy world that often only saw wealth or status, someone had seen her. And rewarded her for simply being decent. 2 days later, Robert walked into the Skyfleet Training Center, an off-site campus where flight attendants, ground staff, and pilots underwent orientation and professional development. But today, it was packed with every active crew member from 3 major regional routes. Mandatory attendance. No excuses. He stepped up to the front of the auditorium, not in a suit, but in the same clothes he had worn on Flight 443. Silence fell. No one had expected him to come in person. He looked out at the rows of uniforms, some stiff with discomfort, others curious, and a few genuinely remorseful. Among them were Amanda and Jason, seated in the back under supervision, facing the consequences of their actions. Robert's voice was steady. "I'm not here to scold. I'm here to remind." He paced slowly. "When I started this airline, I hired people based on heart. You didn't need a fancy accent, a perfect resume, or model looks. You just needed respect, for people. For stories you didn't know. For passengers who might look different but breathe the same air." He paused, letting that settle. "I was mistaken for a beggar. Treated like trash. Laughed at. But I'm not angry because I'm rich. I'm disappointed because I'm human." You could hear a pin drop. "From this day forward, we will reward compassion as much as performance. Courtesy as much as punctuality. We will train you not just to serve, but to see." He held up a small card. It read, "Every seat tells a story. This is your new creed. Learn it. Live it. Or leave." The room burst into applause, not forced, but shaken and inspired. Because deep down, many of them had felt it too, the pressure to perform, to rush, to judge quickly. But now, they had been given something rare in corporate culture. A human reset. And Robert Barlow had led it himself. The applause still echoed in Amanda's ears as she left the auditorium, but none of it was for her. Her hands trembled as she clutched her tote bag, avoiding the gazes of colleagues she once outranked. No one looked at her with admiration anymore. Once considered a rising star among the cabin crew, Amanda had built her confidence on quick decisions and polished charm for VIPs. But underneath it all, she had developed a quiet habit of judgment, especially toward passengers who didn't fit her image of class. Now that habit had destroyed everything. Her email inbox was flooded, not with sympathy, but with notices. Her employee portal access was suspended. A disciplinary hearing was set for Monday. Her supervisors barely responded when she asked questions. Her union rep hadn't returned her call. And worse, her friends weren't replying either. Amanda sat in her tiny apartment, staring at her tablet, watching the replay of Robert Barlow's training speech. She paused on his face, the face she had dismissed just days ago. Wrinkled, tired-looking, with clothes that didn't scream wealth. How could she have missed it? But it wasn't just about failing to recognize the CEO. It was about what she had become, someone who mocked, dismissed, and excluded. The worst part was, deep down, she knew better. Amanda wiped a tear and opened her laptop. With shaky hands, she began to type an email, not to plead for her job, but to say something she had never said in her years on the job. An apology. One not sent to Robert, but to every unknown name in her flight logs over the past year. She may not keep her position. But she wasn't going down without acknowledging the truth. And for the first time in a long time, Amanda felt something new. Remorse. While Amanda battled remorse in solitude, Jason took a very different route. He sat in a downtown cafe with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, reading articles that called him the arrogant flight attendant and the face of airline humiliation. His name was everywhere, and he hated it. He didn't feel guilty. He felt exposed. "This is overkill," he muttered, tossing his phone onto the table. "So I was rude to some old guy. Big deal." Jason still hadn't fully processed that the man he mocked was the actual CEO of the airline. In his mind, this was all an elaborate punishment meant to make an example of him. And he hated being the example. His roommate tried reasoning with him the night before. "Bro, maybe it's time to just admit you went too far." Jason had scoffed. "Please. I've seen worse. I've done worse. Nobody cared until now. He hadn't even opened the formal suspension letter sent to his inbox. He didn't plan to. His pride was louder than the lesson. But the world was already moving on without him. The union wasn't responding. Job recruiters were ghosting him. His usual Instagram posts, cocky, curated shots in uniform, had turned into a war zone of comments. Hope you learned something. This isn't customer service. This is cruelty. Good luck finding another airline that'll hire you. Jason closed the app. His denial couldn't hold forever. Because while Amanda was sinking with regret and trying to swim back to shore, Jason was drowning in arrogance. And no one was throwing him a lifeline. What he didn't know yet, was that the final blow was still coming. From someone he never expected. Across town, in a modest apartment lined with books and soft light, the young woman from seat 29B stared at the letter in her hands for the third time. She had read it. Reread it. Sat down with it. A handwritten note. No signature until the end. Just quiet gratitude. She remembered him, the older man with tired eyes and gentle manners who'd been laughed at and pushed off the flight. She had felt the injustice in that moment, but she didn't know what to do then. She had frozen, unsure whether stepping in would make things worse. Now she knew who he was. And somehow, he had remembered her. She ran her fingers over the smooth Skyfleet voucher tucked inside the envelope. Lifetime first-class access. It was more than a gift. It was acknowledgement. And yet, her heart wasn't at ease. Because while the world was now applauding the CEO for his humility and condemning the staff for their arrogance, she knew what it had felt like to be her, the invisible passenger in the middle. Watching. Wanting to help. Staying silent. So she made a decision. She opened her laptop and wrote a blog post titled, "I sat next to the CEO in seat 29A, here's what I saw." She didn't name names. She didn't go viral for drama. She just told the truth. How she'd watched a man treated like trash because of his appearance. How she'd seen the staff ignore dignity in favor of shallow assumptions. How she wished she had spoken up. Her final words echoed like a whisper to the world. We all think we do the right thing. But sometimes, doing nothing is the wrong thing. I won't make that mistake again. Within hours, her post was shared by hundreds. Then thousands. And for the first time, someone gave voice to the quiet passengers, the ones who see, feel, and remember, even if they don't speak. Until now. At Skyfleet headquarters, the communications team gathered around a large monitor in the media room, watching live updates of the blog post from seat 29B's author. Shares were climbing by the minute. Comments poured in, supportive, emotional, outraged. It wasn't just a trending story anymore. It was a movement. People weren't just praising Robert Barlow for his humility. They were demanding that every airline follow suit. The company's brand manager, Marla Chen, looked visibly nervous. We have to do more, she said, glancing at the head of PR, a statement won't hold them for long. Meanwhile, in Robert's office, he sat watching the same post. A soft smile touched the corner of his mouth, not because of fame or vindication, but prepare an open forum, he said. I want passengers involved in our reform process. Bring in real voices. Including her, seat 29B. Invite her to our advisory panel. Marla blinked in shock. You want her in the same room with board members? No, Robert replied. I want board members in the same room as her. By evening, news broke that Skyfleet would launch the Passenger Voices Initiative, a panel of everyday flyers who would help shape policy, training, and standards for all future crew members. The public responded with overwhelming support. Other airlines began scrambling to copy the strategy. Amanda read the headline on her phone and felt a deep ache in her chest. She knew she'd never be part of that panel. She had become the warning, not the voice. And as Jason scrolled through the same story, still clinging to bitterness, a message pinged on his screen from HR. Final review meeting scheduled. The walls were closing in. But outside those walls, something rare was unfolding. A company was being rebuilt. From the inside. By the people. For the people. The conference room at the HR department was colder than Amanda expected. She sat alone on one side of the long glass table, her palms pressed against each other, her eyes fixed on the blank notepad in front of her. She wasn't wearing her uniform today, just a simple gray blouse and dark jeans. She had dressed to be humble, not polished. The HR director walked in with a folder. Behind her were two ethics board members and a representative from the new Passenger Voices initiative. Amanda didn't recognize the representative, until the woman spoke. It was her. Seat 29B. Amanda's heart sank. "Let's begin," the HR director said. The meeting wasn't designed to attack, it was to assess. Amanda was asked to walk them through the incident, her decision-making, her tone. They asked why she had laughed, why she'd whispered to her colleague. Amanda admitted everything. "There's no excuse," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was wrong. I made assumptions. I spoke to that man like he was less than human. And I regret it." The woman from seat 29B watched her closely, not with anger, but with the quiet intensity of someone who had chosen to speak when it mattered. Amanda turned to her. "I remember you. You didn't laugh. You didn't mock. I saw it in your eyes, you were uncomfortable. I should have followed your lead. I didn't. And I'm sorry, not just to him, but to you." Silence filled the room. The HR director looked down at her papers. "Amanda, due to the nature of the violation and the public visibility of the case, your role with Skyfleet will not be reinstated. However." Amanda looked up. "Your application to attend our new empathy rehabilitation training has been accepted. It's voluntary. Not a guarantee of re-employment. But a start, if you choose it." Amanda nodded slowly, swallowing her pride. She had lost her job. But maybe, just maybe, she could regain her character. And for her, that mattered more. Jason walked into the hearing room with his head high and sunglasses still resting on the collar of his shirt. He didn't greet anyone. He didn't ask questions. He just sat down with a smirk that seemed out of place in the sterile room. The HR director, already weary from Amanda's emotional hearing earlier, opened his file without preamble. "Mr. Hill, you are here to respond to the incident on Flight 443, your conduct toward passenger Robert Barlow, and your ongoing behavior following the suspension notice." Jason leaned back in his chair. "Yeah, about that," he said. "Look, I didn't know the guy was the CEO, all right. Nobody told me." The room fell quiet. The woman from seat 29B, now officially on the Passenger Voices panel, folded her arms and tilted her head slightly. "So you're saying if he wasn't the CEO, your behavior would have been justified?" she asked. Jason shifted. "No, I'm just saying people exaggerate. He wasn't exactly friendly. He looked weird. Like maybe he didn't belong there." The HR director's face hardened. "Jason, that's the very mindset that got you here." Jason scoffed. "So what, I'm supposed to bow to every passenger who looks like they crawled in from the street?" The silence was thick. Even he could feel it. "Jason," the HR director said flatly, "you're not just being removed from your position. You're permanently barred from employment with any Skyfleet affiliate or partner airline. A formal report will be shared with regulatory boards." Jason's smirk dropped. "Wait, what? You showed no remorse. Even now. This isn't about who the passenger was, it's about how you treat people. You failed. Not just as an employee, but as a person. Jason stood, stunned, but no one stopped him from leaving. The door shut behind him with a hollow thud. And for the first time in days, he had no camera, no audience, no applause. Only silence. And consequence. A week after the hearings, Skyfleet Airlines released something rare, a letter from Robert Barlow printed on the back of every boarding pass. It read, "To every passenger, past and future. I once boarded my own flight dressed plainly, hoping to understand your experience. What I witnessed broke my heart. Not because I was disrespected as a CEO, but because I was dehumanized as a person. This company began with a dream, that everyone, no matter their background, would be treated with dignity in the skies. Somewhere along the way, we lost that. But we are finding it again. Because of you. Because you noticed. Because you spoke. Thank you for holding us accountable. Let this be the beginning of a new standard in flight, and in life. Sincerely. Robert Barlow. Founder and CEO, Skyfleet Airlines." Passengers across the world took photos of the letter, posted them online, and shared stories of kindness or cruelty they had experienced while flying. It became more than a company memo, it became a statement of change. Travelers began choosing Skyfleet not for luxury, but for something rarer, integrity. And something even more surprising happened. Competing airlines reached out to Skyfleet for training resources. Workshops were requested. Joint empathy programs were launched. Robert's undercover act had sparked a ripple that shook an entire industry. But amidst all the noise, Robert remained quiet. He still wore simple clothes. Still flew coach sometimes, unannounced. Still paid attention. Because for him, the mission hadn't changed. And he knew. Respect could never be automated. It had to be chosen. Every single flight. Every single day. 3 weeks after the incident, the young woman from seat 29B, whose name was now known across aviation circles as Lena, received her first official invitation to travel as a panel guest. She had been offered first-class access for life, but this was different. This time, she was flying as an agent of change. As she stepped into the exclusive first-class lounge, employees greeted her warmly. Not with forced smiles, but with genuine gratitude. Her blog post had shifted an entire company's culture. Not by shouting, but by writing from the heart. When her name was called for boarding, she was escorted by a senior flight attendant named Rosa, one of the newly retrained staff members who had passed the updated Skyfleet empathy course with distinction. As they reached the gate, Lena paused. "What seat did you say I had again?" Rosa smiled. "Seat 1A. Right at the front. Beside the founder himself." Lena blinked. "Robert's on this flight. He asked for you to sit beside him. He said, he never got to say thank you in person." The cabin was serene. Plush leather seats, ambient lighting, quiet elegance. But it wasn't the luxury that struck Lena. It was Robert. Sitting there in a simple black sweater, reading a paperback novel, looking no different than any retired teacher or grandfather heading to visit family. He stood up slowly and extended his hand. "I'm honored, Lena," he said softly. "I should be saying that to you," she replied. They sat together. Not as CEO and guest. But as two people who understood what it meant to watch the world forget kindness, and then fight to bring it back. As the plane ascended into the clouds, Lena looked out the window and smiled. Because even though her seat had changed, her heart hadn't. And neither had his. Word of Skyfleet's transformation continued to spread like wildfire across the aviation world. Airline executives from Europe, Asia, and Africa began requesting meetings with Robert Barlow. Not for press opportunities, but to learn. What had begun as a humiliation had turned into a blueprint for empathy-driven business. But Robert wasn't interested in media interviews or keynote speeches. Instead, he focused on quietly expanding the Passenger Voices initiative into a global model. Every major Skyfleet hub now had its own panel of real passengers, rotated every quarter, who helped shape service protocols, crew training, and even cabin design. The skies were changing. And people noticed. A middle-aged man in Chicago shared how a Skyfleet steward had helped his autistic son feel safe during turbulence. A teenage girl in Nairobi tweeted about how her mother, dressed plainly and flying for the first time, was addressed as "ma'am" and offered extra help without being asked. Flight crews were changing not because they feared punishment, but because they understood the mission now. Because Robert had lived the experience. And because Lena had written the words that made people listen. Back in his office, Robert hung a framed photograph on the wall. It wasn't of a plane or a company award. It was a screenshot of Lena's blog post, titled, "I sat next to the CEO in seat 29A. Here's what I saw." Just below it, he placed a handwritten sticky note. "Change doesn't start with policy. It starts with one person choosing to care." And across the world, more and more people began choosing just that. One seat at a time. One flight at a time. The ripple was becoming a wave. Amanda sat quietly at the back of the training hall, notebook in her lap, eyes focused forward. The empathy rehabilitation training wasn't like anything she'd expected. There were no lectures, no punishments, no shaming. Just stories. Every day, people came in, passengers, crew, even former airline staff, and told stories of kindness, cruelty, regret, and transformation. It wasn't about remembering policies. It was about remembering people. Amanda had cried more in the last 5 days than she had in 5 years. Not from guilt, but from clarity. On the final day of training, the coordinator handed each participant a blank card and said, "Write a message to your past self. What would you say before Flight 443? Amanda stared at the card for several minutes before finally writing. "Slow down. See people. You don't have to judge to feel in control. Respect costs nothing, but losing it costs everything. Amanda." She tucked the card into her bag and stood, not knowing what her future held. She didn't expect to be hired back. But oddly, she didn't feel bitter anymore. On her way out of the hall, a woman with warm eyes stopped her at the door. It was Lena. Amanda froze. "You probably don't want to." Lena shook her head gently. "Actually, I do." She extended her hand. "Thank you for completing the program. Most people wouldn't have." Amanda swallowed hard. "I'm sorry. For everything." Lena nodded. "I know. That's why this matters." Amanda didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But in that moment, standing in the shadow of her past mistake and the light of someone else's grace, she felt something she hadn't in weeks. Hope. A second chance. Not for her job. But for her soul. Months passed, and Skyfleet continued to evolve. Passengers who had once dismissed the airline as just another company, were now loyal frequent flyers. Not because of perks or prices, but because they felt seen. Then, something unexpected happened. A new internal initiative began circulating quietly through Skyfleet terminals. It wasn't advertised. It wasn't announced. It was called Seat of Kindness. Every day, on random flights across the globe, a single passenger in economy class would be quietly upgraded to first class with no explanation. When they asked why, the flight crew would simply hand them a card that read, "Because kindness should travel far. This seat was gifted to you by someone who once flew unnoticed." Robert never admitted it publicly, but he was the one funding the initiative. He instructed the finance team to quietly create a rotating fund under a different department code. It didn't need a brand name. It didn't need PR. It just needed to be felt. Lena was the only person who knew. And she kept the secret with pride. One afternoon, a young man wearing paint-stained overalls boarded a Skyfleet flight from Lagos to London. He looked exhausted, his fingers rough from labor. He took his assigned seat in the back, folded his arms, and leaned back with a sigh. Then a crew member tapped his shoulder. "Sir, would you mind coming with me?" He stood up, confused. Moments later, he was seated in 1A, sipping cold orange juice and staring at the tiny card in his hand. No cameras. No fuss. Just kindness, traveling quietly through the skies. Exactly as Robert intended. Robert Barlow stood at gate 3A, looking out at the plane bearing his airline's colors. This time, he wasn't flying undercover. He wasn't testing the crew. He was simply taking a flight to visit his grandchildren for the weekend. But something felt different. As he boarded, the entire crew stood in attention. Not to salute a CEO, but out of quiet respect. Most of them had joined the airline after the Flight 443 incident. They'd read about it during training. Some still whispered stories about the day everything changed. The captain came forward. "Mr. Barlow," he said with a steady voice, "we may never forget what happened on that flight, but more importantly, we'll never forget what you did after." Robert gave a small nod. "Just keep flying right." As the plane soared into the clouds, Robert leaned back in his seat and glanced at the passenger across the aisle, a young woman in a nurse's uniform, fast asleep. A worn boarding pass poked out of her pocket. Economy class. Robert smiled. He pressed the crew button and whispered something into the attendant's ear. The woman nodded and quietly walked over to the nurse. Moments later, she awoke to a kind smile and an invitation to switch seats, to first class. She blinked in disbelief. Robert didn't say a word. He simply offered her his seat, walked to the back, and sat comfortably in economy. As the nurse looked back one last time, he gave her a warm, knowing nod. Because legacy isn't built on power. It's built on quiet choices. The ones no one sees. But everyone feels. Skyfleet Airlines had once been like any other, profit-focused, brand-obsessed, reputation-driven. But after the transformation sparked by Robert's quiet humiliation and bold response, the airline began to stand for something much more meaningful. The company released a new internal document called the Skyfleet Standard. It wasn't a manual about seatbelt checks or emergency exits. It was a blueprint for dignity. The first line read, "Every passenger carries a story. Your job is not just to serve them, but to see them." The document was required reading across all departments, from call center agents to airport janitors. It emphasized compassion over charisma, respect over routine. Hiring changed too. Instead of just interviews about handling difficult customers, the process now included role-play scenarios involving empathy, emotional regulation, and active listening. Training included a segment called the Disguise Test, where crew members were observed interacting with actors dressed in plain or tattered clothing, sometimes portraying the elderly, sometimes immigrants, sometimes disabled persons. The goal? To find out who treated every passenger with the same level of care. And promotions began reflecting that. For the first time in years, internal morale skyrocketed. Employee turnover dropped. Passengers were writing letters of praise instead of complaints. Robert received one such letter late one evening. It was handwritten, crumpled at the corners, sent by an elderly man who had flown for the first time in decades. "Your airline made me feel like a person again. Not just a seat number." Robert folded the letter carefully and placed it in a wooden box on his shelf marked, "Why I Started." Because long after the headlines fade and viral posts are forgotten, the standard will remain. Quiet. Firm. Human. And that, more than jets, schedules, or profits, is what keeps Skyfleet in the sky. Months had passed since the company's transformation, and most flights now felt different. Crew members offered service with authentic warmth. Passengers noticed the shift. But one particular flight from Johannesburg to New York would remind everyone, especially Robert, that kindness isn't a policy. It's a heartbeat. Robert, now semi-retired, occasionally reviewed secret flight recordings, with consent from the company's ethical surveillance initiative. But this time, he decided to fly quietly again, no announcements, no titles, no reserved seats. Just a simple man in seat 36C. The flight began as expected. But halfway through, turbulence shook the plane hard. A baby wailed in the middle rows. Passengers panicked. Luggage compartments rattled. A young flight attendant, newly hired and barely 23, kept moving through the aisles, calming passengers with a steady tone and gentle touch. Her name tag read Ruth. Robert watched her closely. When the plane finally steadied, Ruth went row by row, checking on every single passenger, offering water, snacks, even a kind word. When she reached Robert's seat, she paused. "Are you all right, sir?" He smiled. "I'm just fine, Ruth. You handled that like someone who's been flying for years." She blushed, shrugged. "I just kept thinking, if it were my grandfather on board, I'd want someone to check on him too." That struck Robert deeply. After landing, he quietly pulled Ruth aside as passengers exited. "You know who I am?" She blinked. "No, sir." "Should I?" He chuckled. "Not really. But thank you for reminding me why I started all this." He handed her a sealed envelope. Inside was a scholarship to finish her degree in hospitality leadership. And a note. "Empathy can't be trained. It must be lived. And you live it well." That flight wasn't extraordinary because of turbulence. It was extraordinary because someone chose to care. And that, Robert knew, would always be Skyfleet's true first class. Later that year, the Global Aviation Summit in Dubai gathered hundreds of airline executives, analysts, and press. The event was known for its flashy presentations and stiff competition between brands, but this year, something unexpected happened. Skyfleet Airlines, once a modest regional carrier, swept 3 of the top honors. Most Human-Centric Airline of the Year. Best Passenger Experience. Global Ethics in Service Award. The announcement stunned the room. When Robert Barlow's name was called to receive the final award, he stepped onto the stage, not in a tuxedo, but in a plain navy blue suit and brown shoes. The same style he wore the day he was humiliated on his own flight. He didn't carry a written speech. Instead, he stood before the microphone and said, "I wasn't aiming for awards. I was aiming for accountability." He paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. What happened to me on that flight could happen to anyone. And that's the problem. It's not enough to say we value passengers. We have to show it, even W. The room stood and clapped, not just out of respect, but out of realization. Because everyone in that room had once ignored a voice. Overlooked a person. Judged a book by its cover. But today, they were all being reminded that excellence in business meant very little. If compassion wasn't in the cabin. And the man who had been mistaken for a nobody. He had just set a new global standard. 1 year to the day since Flight 443, Robert Barlow booked a quiet one-way ticket, not to inspect, not to test, not to teach, but to let go. He was officially retiring. No press release, no farewell party. Just one final flight as a passenger, blending in with the quiet crowd at the terminal. This time, however, he wasn't anonymous. As he passed through security, several staff members nodded respectfully. A few whispered his name. At the gate, he found himself greeted by a flight crew who had memorized every word of the speech he once gave in the training hall. But no one tried to give him special treatment. They simply treated him like a valued human being. That was all he had ever wanted. As the plane lifted off the runway and climbed into the clouds, Robert stared out the window and allowed himself to breathe. A soft knock on his seat brought him back. A flight attendant, Ruth, stood with a gentle smile and a small envelope. "It's from Lena," she said. "She said you'd know when to open it." He nodded. Later, when the seatbelt sign turned off and the cabin lights dimmed, Robert opened the envelope. Inside was a card that read, "You changed a flight. You changed a company. You changed lives. Now go live yours. Lena, seat 29B, **. He held the card to his chest, eyes glistening, not with sadness, but peace. Because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't carrying a company. Just gratitude. The captain's voice came on overhead. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to recognize a very special passenger aboard today's flight. Mr. Robert Barlow, we thank you for showing the world that kindness still flies." A ripple of soft applause moved through the cabin. And Robert, humble as ever, just smiled at the sky. 2 months after Robert's final flight, Skyfleet unveiled a surprise at their largest airport hub. Passengers, staff, and press gathered around Gate 29, drawn by a curtain and a large silver plaque covered in navy blue cloth. Lena stood quietly near the front row, holding the speech she never thought she'd be asked to give. Robert wasn't in attendance, he was living peacefully on a small farm upstate, off the grid, unreachable by phone. But his legacy was about to echo in a way even he hadn't expected. The airport director stepped up to the microphone. "This gate, Gate 29, is where a moment of injustice led to a movement of reform. Today, we rename this space to honor the man who reminded us that dignity is the greatest luxury." The cloth was pulled down. And there, in bold gold lettering, it read, "The Robert Barlow Gate. Where everyone matters." Gasps and applause followed. But what moved people most was what came next. Beside the gate was a permanent seat, a real airplane seat mounted on a marble platform, unoccupied, with a small plaque above it. Seat 29A. In honor of those who go unseen, unheard, and underestimated. Until their presence changes everything. Inspired by Lena, passenger 29B. People wept. Crew members hugged. Families took photos beside the seat, not as a tourist spot, but as a reminder. Robert Barlow had once been kicked off a flight for looking poor. Now, every traveler who passed through Gate 29 saw his name. Not as a businessman, but as a symbol of grace, change, and courage. And high above that gate, etched in silver letters along a glass beam, were the words Robert had once whispered to himself as the cabin doors closed behind him. "Let them laugh. I know who I am. And now, so did the world." If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more powerful billionaire stories that inspire, humble, and move you. New stories every day, don't miss out.